Students who've witnessed their teacher cry during class. What happened? Story 1. Student that had behavior issues and had a hard time maintaining emotional regulation threw his recorder, the instrument, at the music teacher and it snapped in half. He then threw his desk in her direction and walked out. This was third grade, and all she had asked him to do was listen to the song we were learning. She quit the next week after almost 30 years of teaching. Story 2. That was the day a student died. As I remember hearing it, the kid had an anaphylactic reaction that morning at school and didn't make it. It was a little ways into the day when my algebra teacher got a call on the school phone, got really quiet, and left the room. When he came back in, there were tears in his eyes, and he told us that we were headed to the auditorium for a school assembly, where the principal broke the news of what happened and offered that the guidance counselors would be available for anyone who felt like they needed it. Story 3, Miss Hanlon. Substitute teacher, I still think about her and hope she's doing well. She was posted as the teacher when the usual teachers were off sick. Absolutely zero respect was given to her, and the class knew if we had Miss Hanlon, it was just an extended lunch. We could just mess around and act like animals for the whole lesson. She had physical conditions like a dent in her forehead and a gravelly voice, which prevented her from being able to raise her voice to tell us to be quiet. So the kids would all do Hunchback of Notre Dame impressions, spitballs through straws, and do the coughing game, where they would just cough through whatever she was trying to say. Even as a kid, I felt kind of awful after we'd essentially broken her, and she'd just come in, not even say hello, and pull open a book for an hour and sometimes cry into it. I weirdly still think about her randomly, once or twice a month. I hope she moved on to way better things. School children really have no filter at all. Story 4. On 9/11, we were watching live footage in my high school French class, in French. Our French teacher had friends close to the Trade Center in New York who she kept stepping out to try and call, and each time she left the room we would switch the news channel to English so we could better understand. She came in and cried at us. Story 5. I forgot his name, but he was one of my favorite teachers in high school. He taught English. During class, he was called out to talk to some members of the school administration and a few proctors. It took several minutes, but he returned, taught as much of the class as he could, and then just walked over to his desk and started crying, whimpering. He then left. He just found out his wife, who had also been a teacher, was having an affair with one of the female students. We didn't find out that specific fact until later on, though. Story 6. High school 2003. We had a female Indian teacher who always carried a journal everywhere. A bunch of guys grabbed it during class and started passing it around laughing while she tried to get it back, but she gave up and burst into tears. The whole class went silent. Last day of the year 2003, elderly female teacher let us have free time in a computer lab. Only 5 people showed up to school that day. A guy named Mitchell started looking at prawn, so the teacher asked him to stop, and he replied, "But I'm looking at your mum, miss." She immediately lunged towards him and started choking him from behind and mumbling like a maniac. We all froze in fear. Mitchell took off and left while the teacher sat down crying. It was next level tense and awkward in that room. We just stayed silent until the bell and all ran away. Story 7. I'm a teacher. I cried in front of my toddlers when I got a call from the hospital telling me it was time to make the call as to whether to pull my dad's life support. One of my toddlers came up to me while I was crying, put her hand on my cheek and said, "It's okay to feel sad, it's okay to cry," then gave me a hug. I love my job. Story 8 had an English teacher that was super nice and genuinely loved his job and tried to make his classes informative and enjoyable. He had won the Best Teacher Award the year before I was in his class. He was funny, kind, not creepy or awkward at all, while my class was filled with cynical a-holes. We learned his first name was Mark, and we all began to call him by that name or goofy variation of it. He asked us calmly and respectfully to please call him our Mr. Surname. We didn't continue with the first name. We also often interrupted him while he spoke and would ignore our work. It got to a point he was so upset, he just stopped trying one day, sat at his desk, and started crying. None of us even noticed at first. Eventually, one student noticed and rather loudly asked, "What's wrong? First name." He replied, "I've lost the respect of the whole class, and I don't know how to handle this. I've never felt so disrespected. I don't even know what I did to lose everyone's respect." We all felt pretty bad at that point. The disrespect had been normal since the beginning of the school year from our class. He excused himself to go get himself together and left the room. We all discussed what had happened and agreed to behave more respectfully. He came back in the room to us all working on the assignment quietly. A few of us apologized for our actions. He really didn't deserve the way we had been acting. Story 9. I had an engineering prof breakdown in class. It was a class in control systems. Something we were working on reminded him of his experience building a particular weapon system for Vietnam. I won't name it because I don't want to out my proof. And he started talking about not just building it, but touring the test site afterwards. It had been an untouched small village. After the weapons test, they went in on the ground to assess the destruction. He said, there wasn't anything in the whole village. Nothing bigger than my fist. Than my fist. We all just sat there in silence for a minute. He composed himself and went on. And nothing was ever spoken of it again. Story 10. This was many moons ago when I was in high school and we had a fresh, shiny, out-of-the-box new teacher for our sophomore English class. She had a hate-at-first-sight relationship with two guys in the class. They'd walk into the room and she would literally lose her crap on them. It was impressive. They eventually started retaliating with mean pranks and disruptions. They started arguing with everything she said and did. By the end of the first 6 weeks, we walked into class one day. She burst into tears and left the room. We never saw her again, and from what I heard later, she never set foot in another classroom. Story 11. I haven't actually seen any of my teachers cry yet, but last year one came close enough that I'll post it here. She is from Armenia and undoubtedly cares about the country. Back in September 2022, Azerbaijan launched attacks on Armenia. Luckily, that round didn't last long, and it really hit her. When she told the class about the news, it was very emotional for her, and at some points, it sounded like she was going to cry. So far, she was the sweetest instructor I've had in college, and it was heartbreaking to see her like that. Story 12. A group of boys bullied the teacher. She was close to retirement and, in all honesty, wasn't very good, but she didn't deserve what they put her through. They were absolutely horrible. Wouldn't do any work, sit and laugh when she talked. Mocked her if they put their name down on the board. There were 3 of us girls who wanted to learn, but us telling them to shut up would get the whole class acting up, and so much worse. One day she was covering for a sick teacher, so we actually had her twice. The boys were craps in the first lesson. The rest of the class were worse in the afternoon. The girl next to me threw her pen down in frustration because we couldn't learn what she was trying to explain to us, and the teacher just sat down at her desk and started crying. Eventually, she got up and walked out the classroom. The deputy head came in a few minutes later and told us he was very disappointed in all of us, and we sat in silence for the rest of the class. After that, she always had a second member of staff in the classroom, and we learnt in silence. On a nice note, me and the girls who tried to stick up for her and the girl who threw her pen down in the other class all got a special thank you note from her the week after. Story 13. Not a teacher, but someone who worked at the school. He was an adult, maybe in his 40s, and he had come to Norway many years ago. He was just a normal guy, quite funny too. I remember some interactions between the two of us fondly. One day, our teacher pulled him in for history class. This was 10th grade. We had just gotten done with World War II teachings, and we were briefly going over the Bosnian War. I kind of realized then why he joined us for that class. He starts telling us who he really is. He was born and raised in Bosnia and moved to Norway after the war had started. He cries as he tells us the horrors he personally experienced before he was able to leave Bosnia. The entire class was silent the whole time, even the boys who were known to cause trouble during class. I don't remember much more of that day, other than him apologizing for crying and leaving the class after the class period had ended. I saw him at the store I work at a few weeks back after a few years of not seeing him. I hope he's doing all right. Story 14. 9th grade phys ed. We had a supply teacher and we were in a portable for the period. Never saw this woman at the school. Thick accent, and she had a balance of lacking authority and constantly telling us what to do. I think her last name is pronounced Nozire, but it sounded like nose hair when she said it. Anyway, a couple students, acquaintances of mine, were teasing her by making noise, chatting, not doing their work, etc. An entire hour of them misbehaving made her crack, and she raised her voice, got real vocal with them. She threatened to call the office. Instead, got erasers lightly tossed at her head. I'm not joking. After some back and forth fooling around, I guess her voice got a bit hoarse, and she just sat down, put her hands on her head, and wiped her eyes. We were 10 minutes away from the bell, and she dismissed us, which is rare. Those 2 students didn't face any real discipline, unsure why. I can't speak for who they are nowadays, but they were your typical HS crap disturbers, nothing out of the ordinary. Story 15. This was a college professor for a writing class. Towards the end of term, his cat died. He was in tears throughout class that day and seemed both sad and as if he was holding back bitterness, which was understandable. He ended up apologizing at the end of class and gave us all free A's on the final. I hope he's doing better now. Story 16. I wasn't going to post this because it seems so minimal compared to everything else, but I feel like it might be a bit of a light read. I'm an educator and teach 2 to 3 years old. I cried once because somebody accidentally slid my hand into a closing door and it freaking hurt, so I cried. Cue bunch of children running over for cuddles, one handing me a tissue and another verbally asking my co-teacher for an ice pack for me and holding it to my hand. It was adorable, so I cried more LOL. Story 17. In middle school, we were learning about how parchment or paper was made in history class. This sweet young teacher made paper like this as a hobby and brought it to class to show as a demonstration. After explaining the process of making each individual sheet and gluing it together into a book, one of the more crass students said it was a stupid waste of time and money. She broke down instantly. Story 18. The mother of my teacher died, and in the beginning of the class, he couldn't hold it and cried for 5 minutes and said that we should all hug our mother because it's devastating if you can't do it anymore. He stopped crying and tried his best to move on with class and teach us some things. He was one of the best teachers that I knew. Story 19. We found the electrical distribution board in her classroom. It was in a really weird place, nowhere near her class. Between classes, someone would go and flip a switch depending on what she had planned, like turn off only the plug that ran the projector, turn off all the lights, on a hot day, turn off the fans, etc., etc. We had a lot of free periods while she tried to fix the problems. Our class got a bit overconfident doing this, and someone tried to do it while on a bathroom break. Principal caught him, dragged him back to class, and made him confess to the teacher what he was doing. Kid wasn't going down on his own and started naming who else had turned off switches, as well as everyone who knew the plan, which was the entire class. Teacher burst into tears and went on to say how betrayed she felt that the entire class was in on it and had specifically targeted her. At the time, we thought it was a harmless prank to get out of work. It was her first year teaching, and we all felt really bad. Story 20. My 7th grade English teacher's first baby died shortly after he was born, still in the hospital. It was from some kind of unexpected medical event. A few weeks later, she came back to school, but was very clearly in a bad way. She lost tons of weight too. She took some time to talk about her baby and broke down. She ended up taking the semester off. I always liked her as a teacher, though, and was happy for her when she had 2 more kids. Story 21. She was a substitute. The reason she was there in the first place was because our actual teacher was on a sick leave, basically, for being mentally done with us. So yeah, she jumped right into a hornet's nest, and it was brutal. My class was pretty much among the worst in the whole school. So one day she just broke down into tears and started venting about how she totally understands why our teacher is gone. I think it was actually an eye-opening experience to many of my classmates as well, because their behavior significantly improved after this. Story 22. I tried to gently explain to my grade 6 teacher that porcupines climb trees, while she insisted porcupines cannot climb trees. When the rest of the children in class backed me up, she burst into tears, screaming that we all hate her, that everyone hates her, and then ran down the corridor sobbing uncontrollably. We never saw her again. I never again engaged a teacher in a friendly debate over whether porcupines can or cannot climb trees. Story 23, I don't remember correctly, but there was this teacher that threw the book to the ground and walked away crying because no one was paying attention to her class. 2 other classmates followed and made sure she was okay. Then there was that time a teacher started talking and was tired of getting warnings and stuff like that because our class was extremely noisy. So she tried to plead to my classmates in order to stop them and then started crying while doing so. Story 24. My sports med teacher had fertility issues. When she was about 30 weeks, she slipped in our classroom and fell. She had a full panic attack because she was so scared she was going to lose the baby. Luckily, her husband coached at our school so that they were able to go to the doctor right away. She came back 2 days later and was extremely grateful that a bunch of high schoolers had helped her, and thankfully the baby was okay. She cried when she fell and then when she came back as well. Story 25. My English teacher my junior year of high school was from New York. Her brother still lived in New York and was a window washer that cleaned the windows for the World Trade Center buildings and the surrounding buildings. She was my first teacher, and the morning on 9/11 she spent most of the day trying to get a hold of her brother or any information on her brother from family. She was crying all day while trying to hide that she was crying. Her brother thankfully was late leaving for work and wasn't in the area when the attacks happened. I'll never forget her phone call to her mom when my teacher told her mom what was happening. Her mom was in an assisted living facility, and how she hadn't heard from her brother yet. Story 26, my 7th grade English teacher in the early 2000s. I remembered his birthday and gave him a throw pillow that said something along the lines of, "Teachers are the key to a better world," or something. He was so touched. He was the strictest but best teacher I've ever had in my life. Made us stand up any time an adult walked into the room, out of respect. Also let us take our books outside on beautiful days and do the lessons out there. Really brought the books to life. Had us build our own kites when reading The Kite Runner, etc. He ended himself a few years later and other teachers were bullying him about being gay. The teacher bullies were worse than the kids. Such a terrible loss. He was such a wonderful man and teacher. Story 27. I was the teacher. I taught 4th grade, but prior to that was a personal care assistant at the same school working with an 8-year-old girl with severe autism, nonverbal, violent, just overall rough. Our school couldn't handle the violent behavior, and she posed a threat to the other kids and herself physically, so she was sent to a school better equipped to handle her. And it changed everything about the little girl because she received proper services. Fast forward to me teaching 4th grade, I was eating lunch in my classroom by myself when the principal came in. She shared with me that the little girl who I once worked with had died. She escaped the hotel she was living in, ran across the highway and got hit by a semi-truck and died. I was shocked. This little girl had lived such a hard life and then this. Well, my kids came back to my classroom and I couldn't hold it together. I never told my 4th graders why I left the room crying, but it was hard to look at my innocent children knowing I had lost a former innocent child in such a horrific way. I think about her every day. Story 28. We were a class of mainly 14-year-old boys at a religious school, where apart from one or two, all the teachers were Marist brothers. We got a new English teacher, who was a woman in her late 20s, and my memory's hazy, was from the Philippines. She started off okay, but soon lost control once we realized she wasn't able to punish us. We treated her like crap. No one paid her any attention. Half the class talking or doing other work. Being disrespectful. We treated it like a game, with every class getting more out of control. About 6 weeks into the term and halfway through the class, she burst into tears and walked out. Never saw her again. It was shameful what we did to that poor woman. The school did punish us, but I don't remember how, and the next term we had a new lay teacher. He was from the UK and had previously taught at a Borstal, so didn't take any crap. In spite of that, he was well-liked and one of our better teachers. Story 29, I cried in the middle of class when I found out my student had been shot. He survived only to be shot again a few months later and passed away. I stepped out of the room and came back with my eyes bloodshot. My students thought I'd been smoking weed. When I told them why I'd been crying, they already knew about the shooting before I did. They didn't understand my emotions because the boy had survived. It was shocking to me how unfazed they were by the situation, but then again, many of them had already experienced the death of a young member of their community several times over. Story 30, a mixture of things. She was going through a nasty divorce. She was in a job that was way beyond her abilities, head of year, and the class next door was being noisy because the teacher hadn't showed up. So she went next door. There was a door between the rooms, smacked the nearest child over the head with a dictionary, realized what she'd done, came back to our class, screamed at us to back off, then went sobbing out of the room. Weirdly, she taught at the school for 3 more years after that. I think it's because the kid she hit was a massive bellend anyway, and it was a very rough divorce. Story 31, I think it was in mid-school or high school, but my classmates at those times were quite misbehaving. They'd always talk loudly during class and not care about homeworks and stuff. My English teacher was very devoted to his job and did his best to teach, but it's hard when you're teaching stubborn students. At first, he was fine, then a few warnings, until he became so annoyed, he started getting mad at everyone. Yet my classmates still wouldn't care, to the point he cried, and rage quitted the classroom, and my classmates then asked for forgiveness from him. After that, he told his sad childhood life about being from a broken family and having struggles in life. This made me realize teaching ain't easy, and he had a rough life, and my classmates are just making it rougher. Never abused him. In fact, I was one of his favorites in class.
Story 1. In high school, they would do trivia questions after the announcement sometimes, and the first teacher who dialed the office with the correct answer would get a prize for the class. My math teacher really wanted to win, and hadn't yet this year, So one fateful morning, the question went out, and we had the answer, so he called in, but we were the second caller. In a fit of pseudo-rage, he yells, "Damn it!" and kicks this little plastic trash can across the room, where it bonks a kid right in the head. His eyes go wide, and he apologizes and asks if the kid is okay, which he is. Everyone got a good laugh afterwards, including the kid who got hit, and later we would pretend to duck whenever we didn't win the morning trivia contests. Story 2. I had a history teacher in high school who was always stern and serious, which was great since it gave a reverence to what he was teaching about. And his unpretentious nature meant he spoke about what was important and interesting. One day, however, his voice broke, and after he cleared his throat, it broke again. He stopped talking, put his hands in his pockets, frowned, and took a few breaths. "Students, sorry about this lecture. My wife and I just decided to get a divorce." He blankly stared ahead for a second and then walked toward the door, loosening his tie. "I need a drink." He exited the door. After a second, he poked his head back in. "Of water. I'm coming back. Don't think I've forgotten about Napoleon." Not too much of a meltdown, but he was a pretty manly dude in a nerdy sort of way. Story 3. Our freshman English teacher was a small, soft-spoken woman who was kind of known to be a teacher you could walk all over with little repercussions. We were in a review session after school, and some upperclassmen were just hanging out in the hallways making lots of noise, so she was constantly poking her head out in the hall asking them to be quiet. As we are all very silently reading or something, the classroom door absolutely slammed shut, so hard the latch didn't have time to catch, and the door bounced back open. The teacher immediately yells, "Oh, hell no," and kicks off her heels and takes off out the door. She caught up with the kid, who had taken a running start and kicked the door shut, and berated him for a good 10 minutes, which we could hear clear as day from the end of the hall. It was like nothing we'd ever heard from her. Story 4. I was in a band. One day, one of the regular always in trouble disruptive students was being extra disruptive while the director was trying to tell us something important. So after about 5 different times of going the normal route to get him to settle down, he cracked. It got quiet, and then the director bellowed, "William, are you stupid or just don't give a crap?" The whole room was quiet. All eyes were now on the disruptive kid who was then trying to hide behind his tuba. Then, the director continued with his announcement like nothing happened. Story 5. My super dorky history teacher in 8th grade was the nicest teacher I've ever met. But there were a couple class clowns in our class, and he usually dealt with them okay. One day, though, they were obnoxious to the entire class from the moment he walked in, and he snapped, yelling and chucking his stapler across the room. He nailed a staple right into Ben Franklin's forehead. He immediately apologized and went about his day normally, while all the students went silent. Nobody ever bothered him again after that day. Story 6. A Spanish teacher I had in high school ended up having a meltdown on the day of the final exam. The whole semester, my class had been pretty chatty, but really nothing that out of the ordinary. On the day of the final, there was an event that set her off. If I remember correctly, he was talking during the exam. His cell phone may have gone off instead. It's been a while. She proceeded to attempt to pick up the desk with a 17-year-old sitting in it and slam it on the ground. The kid got up, and then she flung the desk along the floor, slamming it against the door, and told him to finish his exam outside. Then she proceeded to tell the rest of us what terrible people and students we were. She also told us that she had gained 20 pounds over the course of the semester because of how bad our class was. Then she felt the need to tell us about how she'd been raped as she broke down sobbing. After that, I just did my best to finish my exam as quickly as possible so that I could go home, as that was my last class of the year before summer. Story 7. Junior year of high school, I decided to take a psychology class. The administration switched a lot of teachers around that year and hired a lot of new ones too, so I didn't know anything about him. As the semester goes on, his behavior starts slipping, and the class starts noticing. He begins to lose his patience more and more frequently when the class doesn't respond to a question immediately. His behavior then progressed to him throwing whiteboard markers at students for not paying attention or answering incorrectly. Then one day, about half the way into the semester, he completely loses it. A group of 3 students laughed at something within their own conversation just as class was starting, and our teacher saw and made a comment to the class that if we weren't going to listen, he would make today hell. Some kid spoke up saying he would go to the principal if he did anything to hurt the class. So the teacher began throwing markers, erasers, anything he could find at the student. The student got up to leave for the principal's, and the teacher stood up on his desk and screamed at us. He ran to the front of the classroom, where the student who spoke out was, picked up a desk and threw it at the student. Thankfully, it didn't hit him, but the teacher ran to the door to prevent anyone from leaving, and said if anyone said anything about that day to anyone, he would ruin their lives. Some friends and I told the principal and administration, and I actually had to go into court to testify. Turns out, the guy suffers from schizophrenia as well as some degree of PTSD after serving in the military. I don't remember what ended up happening with him. At the time, I really didn't care to know. Bummer. I really wanted to hear this end with something like, at the end of the semester he tied his erratic behavior to a lesson plan. Some kind of Dead Poet Society or something. We had a physics teacher in 11th grade that fake reversed graded the first big exam. All the smart kids did bad, didn't understand why, and the couple broke down. He quickly blended that into the next lesson and handed out the proper grades at the end of the class. Was a total mind F. Story 8. Junior year in university, my genetics professor was in the middle of a lecture when authorities took him out of the auditorium, thank goodness, and informed him that his wife, the dean of our college, had been struck and killed by a motor vehicle that morning. He retreated to his office and proceeded to tear the place apart like a tornado had gone through it. He ripped the top of his desk off its frame, pulled down all of his bookcases, books, pages, papers, all sorts of documents and furniture strewn everywhere in pieces. By the time I graduated, he still wasn't the same man as he was before that awful day. Story 9. This was in high school. We had a band teacher. His nickname was Pinky because he had very red hair and pale skin with a red tint, borderline albino. Every time he got mad, his entire face turned tomato red. I don't remember the sequence of events, but he was already frustrated. Everyone in the room knew to shut up so that we didn't piss him off. Well, everyone except this one dippy girl. She asked something along the lines of, "Are you mad?" and kept pestering him. He finally snapped. His face turned that familiar shade of tomato red, and he threw the pencil he was using to conduct across the room. He then stormed out and slammed the door hard enough that it could be heard on the other side of the building. He quit soon after. Story 10. Year 9 math class. Our teacher was sick, and an early 20s substitute teacher came in to cover. She was lovely, kind, friendly, although a bit timid and shy. One girl in our class used a fountain pen to flick ink on a shirt she was wearing one day. Poor woman noticed her do it, didn't say a word, and just went to her desk, put her head in her hands, and sobbed. Didn't even move for 10 minutes at least. Eventually, a friend of mine went to get another teacher. The sub was escorted out, still crying, and was seen for the rest of the day just crying in her car, not moving for another 4 or so hours. Story 11. 8th grade math teacher. He was well known for his short temper, but this particular day was bad. There was a kid in my class, Justin, that never listened and never did his homework. One day, the math teacher just had it with Justin, grabbed his desk with him in it, and picked it up and slammed it back down on the ground a few times. After that, he shoved the desk with Justin in it across the room. Justin was fine, thankfully, but the math teacher just stormed out. Told my mom, and I guess a few other parents called the school about it too. He was gone for a few weeks and had to take anger management classes. I just went by my old middle school a few weeks ago, and he's the assistant principal now. Who would have expected that? Story 12. In high school, our government teacher freaked out on my class. We had a few talkers in the back corner, but they finally broke him. He flipped his podium lectern over and started screaming at us. He called us the worst group of kids he'd ever had to teach, and that he was 110% accurate that we were going to be nothing. He then went to his desk and drank his entire thermos of coffee. A few years later, he was having a retirement party at his house. I was close friends with his son. He revealed that the thermos was 80% vodka and 20% coffee. Story 13. Had a sub in 5th grade. I was a really unorganized kid, and having to dig through my desk for crap wasn't uncommon. Sub went to collect our homework one by one, and I was still digging through, pulling a bunch of stuff out when she got to me. She started towering over me and told me this was unacceptable, dumped my desk in front of me and told me I was staying in from recess to organize it. One girl said, "You can't make him do that." And the sub raised her voice and spit out, "You don't tell me what to do, brat. I can do whatever I want." The whole class revolted, and a neighboring teacher came in to see what was up. The sub claimed I was being lippy, and this was my punishment. Then the whole class spoke up and informed him of what really happened, and we were all let out for recess. Came back in, and a lunch lady was sitting at the teacher's desk instead. As the kid who was always picked on by everyone, it was nice to see the whole class stand up for me that day. Story 14. I taught public high school for 7 years and have been teaching in a university ever since. Every time one of these threads pops up, I expect to find the story of how I once broke down in tears when a cell phone rang in class. Or the time I threw up in a trash can, brushed my teeth with bottled water in front of all 42 students, asked a janitor to come down and take the trash out, and went back to teaching after my favorite student of all time faked barfing noises because he knew it would make me puke. Story 15. My junior year in nursing school, we took a nursing psych class. The professor was not a good teacher, to put it lightly. She regularly would talk about her personal life instead of teaching what was outlined on the syllabus. About halfway through the course, we had our midterm exam, which consisted of about 75% of questions of stuff we had not covered in class. I think the highest grade anyone got was a 65%. The next class, she berated us and told us all we were going to be bad nurses. One of the people in my class wrote a letter to her, saying that she spends most of the classes not teaching the material, and it's not justifiable to give us exams if we know more about her personal life than what we are supposed to be taught, citing the syllabus given to us at the beginning of the semester. All of us in the course signed the letter. Next class, she absolutely lost it on us, screaming at us about how disrespectful we are and how we will never amount to anything. This got to the point that the dean of the nursing program heard her from down the hall and had to come remove her from the classroom. Next class, we had another professor for the rest of the semester. The dean told us she was on hiatus and said that we brought up our grievances in a respectful manner and commended us on that. The professor who broke down never came back to teach at the school. Story 16. I was bullied a lot around this time, and I started fighting back against the bullies. The teacher noticed this and thought it'd be a good idea to remove me, and who is essentially my arch nemesis, from the playground during lunch, and make us do crafts in a classroom instead. I think they were trying to make us get along by working together, but that doesn't happen with 11-year-olds. Unsupervised for a whole hour in a locked classroom. She leaves, and when she returns halfway through the hour, the classroom is a mess, chairs strewn everywhere, our school jumpers and shirts are torn. I had a bleeding ear and he had a swollen lip and bruises everywhere. We freeze as soon as she catches us, and she just collapses to the ground. She sobbed into her hands. "All I wanted was for you to be friends. Was that so much to ask?" She wept uncontrollably for the next 5 minutes. We felt awful about it. We shook hands and tried to clean up the classroom. The next day, we had a substitute teacher, who eventually became our permanent one, and he was horrible. I guess it worked though. It's 16 years later, and I'm on the way to my enemy's house to drink and play board games. So, yeah. Story 17. My 8th grade algebra teacher, also German teacher, Mr. Cogburn, was an interesting guy. He was tall, had kind of wild-looking frizzy gray hair and a beard, and had a sort of boisterous, larger-than-life kind of personality. He started every single class by slamming the door and yelling. He yelled, or as I would realize once I got into theater in high school, he projected, through the entire class period, though he never really came across as intimidating. He always had a yardstick in his hand that he would slap forcefully against the blackboard to emphasize what he was saying. He would also slap it against the desks of students who weren't paying attention, though he was exceedingly careful to not actually hit the student. It wasn't terribly uncommon for him to break yardsticks, and there was always another one in the supply cabinet to replace the one he'd broken. He had a little song/chant he made up for remembering the slope-intercept form of an equation for a line that I will probably remember until the day I die. He also gave the most effective, and to 8th graders both hilarious and embarrassing, explanation of how to divide fractions. He stood on a desk and told us, "Always divide the top." He pointed at his head. "By the bottom." He then turned around and pointed at his own ass. "Never divide the bottom because the bottom," here he helpfully gestured up and down the length of his ass, "is already divided." That's what Mr. Cogburn was like. He was big and loud and crazy, but not in a scary way. We told new students that the way to tell he was actually mad was if he started the class by shutting the door like a normal person and speaking quietly, and that was when they should be scared. Now we get to the story of the meltdown. Every year, our school did an event called the Mathathon. Students were given math worksheets and tried to solve as many problems as they could in a set amount of time. People, usually the parents, would sponsor the students, pledging a certain amount of money for each problem correctly solved, and at the end, the money was donated to a local charity that helps the disabled. It was that time of year, and Mr. Cogburn was explaining the Mathathon to my class. And when he got to the part about the charity and what they did, one boy, who probably thought himself incredibly cool and edgy, loudly said, "I don't know why anyone bothers to help those tards. We should just let them all die." And Mr. Cogburn transformed. As I said before, dude was tall, well over 6 feet, but his height never came across as imposing at all. Now, he loomed over that student's desk like the freaking angel of death. He seemed to physically radiate pure rage. I swear to all that's holy, you could feel his outrage coming off of him in waves. Even though he was focused solely on the one boy, students halfway across the room sank down in their chairs in pure terror, trying to disappear under their desks. I know because I was one of them. We couldn't even look at him, not out of the usual crap he's mad, don't make eye contact instinct most people have, but more like it was a form of physical protection. He was a burning sun of anger, and if we looked directly at that sun, it would blind us. He spoke very, very quietly to the boy for about a minute. I didn't make out what he said. Then he led the kid out of the room and shut the door. About a quarter of the class started crying as soon as he left. After a while, the other math teacher came in and taught for the rest of the period. What we all found out later, and which none of us, including that boy, had known, was that Mr. Cogburn's daughter, who he spoke about to us frequently enough, was not his only child. He and his wife had also had a son that was born extremely physically disabled, and who had died at a very young age from health complications arising from those disabilities. When he took that student out of the room, I think we all thought that he was going to kill him. He actually just took him down to the principal and explained what the kid had said, and the kid was suspended for a day. Mr. Cogburn also took the rest of the day off. So that was the biggest meltdown I have ever seen from a teacher, and it was sort of the inverse of a normal meltdown. When he was shouting, gesticulating wildly, and hitting our desks with yardsticks, we loved the guy and feared nothing. But that day when he got so quiet, we felt mortal effing terror.